Hey there, Money Heroes. It's Stephanie, your host and fellow explorer on the Be Your Money Hero podcast. We're diving into the nitty-gritty of personal finance and having real conversations about how money, spirituality, psychology, and our life stories all dance together. This podcast is educational, but I'm not a therapist, and my guests and I cannot offer personalized advice through a podcast. My goal is to create a safe place for you to learn and get curious about yourself and expand the way you've thought about money. So if you're ready, let's dive in. Tara Alexander is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's been doing this work for over 30 years. That work has included school counseling, crisis center, a college professor, and a private practice. She's a registered art therapist and a certified coach who helps women who struggle with conflict due to trauma. She also speaks and trains groups on trauma-informed conflict resolution. And in this episode, you're going to learn how to better approach safe conflict, even when you feel your heart racing and it's uncomfortable for you. I will issue this trigger warning. We will be discussing domestic violence and abuse during this episode, so just be aware. But Tara, thanks for coming on the show. I've been looking forward to this all week.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much. I've been looking forward to it as well. I'm so excited to be here.
Will you give our guests a little bit of an introduction about how you came into this work and what it did you do?
Of course. I've been a mental health counselor, as you said, for over 30 years. I'm an LCSW. So I have a background in basically everything that a counselor does. So a lot of mood disorders, anxiety, of course, grief and trauma. Those are basically the things that people come into counseling for. And then there are other things, but those are the big four. And then what I noticed as a counselor, counselors are really good at unpacking the past. I call it Ghost of Christmas Past. And people come in and we deal with Ghost of Christmas Past. But when people want to move forward, the counselor tends to be like, yeah, that's because of your childhood. Right. But I want to move forward because that's because of your childhood. Because of your childhood. And counselors can really get hung up in the past. So out of that grew my coaching business, and I started doing life coaching. And coaches are about Ghost of Christmas Present and Ghost of Christmas Future. And coaching is wonderful. But what happens with coaches is coaches can really not want to deal with the messy stuff, especially coaches who don't have a counseling background. And they're like, oh, that's really messy. I don't want to unpack Ghost of Christmas Past. Let's just focus on the present and the future. And so sometimes things are caught up in the past. And so I'm able to put those two together. So that's how I got to do both of these things. I didn't get into the conflict part, but that's how I got to put both of those together.
I think that that's super valuable because all of those things have to be addressed in a more holistic way. And sometimes it's two people working together, working with a coach and a therapist. But it's great that you're able to really put those two things together as seamlessly as you do. Mm-hmm. We get to talk about something that I've had to work on a lot. And I know that there is still work for me to personally do on the topic of our early life experiences, particularly those related to conflict and trauma and how it impacts our relationships now. So I know that I've shared with the audience, like there was some abuse in the household when I was growing up. And so anytime there was conflict, it felt physically unsafe. And that's what led me to struggle around creating boundaries in previous relationships, since I was always walking on eggshells and trying to please everybody to avoid any conflict that might feel unsafe. And so that had really damaged my past marriage, which had ended in divorce. And even now I'm with my husband. He's incredible, the most patient, stable, grounded person I think I've ever met. And it's still really hard for me to bring up issues that I even think might have some conflict in them. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you've seen in your work and if you would share a little bit more about that.
Well, you are not alone. I had the same exact experience growing up in a household where just using the word no, you could be physically harmed because people in my family were more passive aggressive, or they would throw hints, or you could just be harmed because you stated a preference. So everyone was shoving their emotions down, and we had what we call the tick, tick, tick. And then one day you would blow up about something that happened 2 months ago. It was just not a healthy way of coping because they didn't, the people around me didn't have healthy ways of coping, expressing boundaries and conflict. So they couldn't teach it to me. I had to go out and learn those things for myself. So we're in the same boat. What happened was, as a counselor and as I met healthier people in my life, I had to figure this out as well. But what I want to make a distinction is there are people who move through the conflict and they're in healthier relationships, and they have the ability to address conflict and set those boundaries, but then they feel stuck because all of that trauma from the past is really still stuck in your body. And it just all comes forward, right? It feels like the past is still happening because you feel frozen or you have rages or whatever, even though that's not happening in the present. And the people around you are loving and kind, and they're saying, tell me what is happening. And it's just like whatever's happening, your freeze response or there's the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. They consider these the major 4Fs, and they're adding on now. So one of those 4Fs is happening, and the loving people around you are like, what is going on? Just tell me. Okay, so we consider this like one group that's happening. There are other people, other groups of, I'll consider women or people, that they're still stuck in these situations where they don't have the power. They still could be harmed. And this is where we're getting more into domestic violence, like you mentioned in the beginning. Because anytime we state a boundary, we state our preference, there's a consequence, right? So if you say it to your loving husband and he says, tell me how you feel, he may say, that's wonderful. I'm so happy to know what's going on. And he may graciously accept that. But there are some people who could be physically harmed, or they could have their spouse be passive aggressive with them, or they could have their spouse hide money from them. So that's a different situation. And I really want to make a clear distinction before people go out and they start setting boundaries and using their voice, that we really want to be clear about how we're addressing conflict. Does that make sense?
I think that that's a very good thing to clarify, because those are two very different situations.
Yeah.
So thank you for making that distinction.
Okay. Yeah.
So what are some common conflict patterns that you've observed in your therapy practice?
Well, like I said, many of us were trained to not deal with conflict. Whatever the situation was, either in their childhood, it was either unladylike, children are seen, not heard, women don't have these opinions, don't rock the boat. It could be any of these things. And so women are not able to use their voices. I'm in a situation now where a man is telling me what I'm saying. I'm trying to explain it. He's interrupting me to finish my sentence for me. And it's mansplaining, and it's incredibly frustrating. So even though I know how to address conflict and I know how to use my voice, we have men talking over us. It's still an issue. So there's lots of things that can be happening, and knowing how to handle these in an appropriate way it's just a common thing that we have to keep addressing. And I don't want to speak in monoliths, but we have to also think about white privilege. White women, and this is a monolith, have more privilege than women of color, have more of a dance to do because they have to think about their voice. And it's, women of color is a large monolith, but there is different when you have white privilege versus a woman of color versus a woman who has a sexual minority versus women who are non-binary, not women who are non-binary, but non-binary people or homosexual or bisexual. So when you're double and triple minorities, it makes it more difficult to express yourself. Does this make sense?
It does. And do you think that there are specific trauma responses that tend to be more prevalent when it comes to financial stress and how we can recognize and navigate those responses?
Absolutely. What I see is for people who have childhood trauma, I notice that, when you're dealing with childhood trauma, there is sometimes a tendency to dissociate. That's how we have survived our childhood trauma. We just check out. Right. And so as we grow up as adults, sometimes we're using dissociation still to get through day to day, or we're just exhausted. I don't know about you, Stephanie. By the time I was 18, I was already burnt out just from surviving my childhood. Or, people say all the time, like, if one more person tells me I'm resilient, I'm going to punch them, right? Because that resiliency of having to cope day to day to day. So how that affects financial decisions is we just can't handle one more thing. And so we can sometimes put our financial decisions on our partners or our parents or our friends because it's just so much to handle with day-to-day stressors. So we're not making decisions for ourselves financially. For example, I'll ask one of my female clients specifically, do you know if you're on the deed to the house? You're paying the mortgage. Do you know? Like, I can't handle like having to fight with my husband to find out if I own my own house with him. Or do you know where all the checking accounts are, the passwords? And women don't want to fight with their partners or have to dig up all that information because they know it's going to cause conflict. So having to create more chaos in their lives when they're just trying to survive day to day causes them to check out.
And that's one of the things that one of the money stories that we call money avoidance is when you're too tired or if it's stressful, we tend to just push it off and it's out of sight, out of mind. And whatever link has been created, money is somehow related to stress or, the feeling of not being safe in some way, shape, or form. And so what are some ways that if somebody has been avoiding this in the past, how can they start to bridge that gap?
I encourage people to compartmentalize it, to take a little bit at a time, one day a week or one task at a time. First, find out where the files are kept. First, find out what kind of bank, where is the bank, just break it down into small chunks rather than try to break through everything all at one time. And then set a list of 1 through 10, the things you need to find out, and then do 1 Tuesday morning. And then next Tuesday, do 2. It's better than making no headway at all. Find out what your spouse's social security number and, discuss with them about running at least your own credit check. Absolutely. You need to run your own credit checks to find out what credit cards are open in your name and make sure no one's opened credit cards in your name. So take it little by little.
And when it comes to the deed on the house, like that could even be something that you can check for yourself because most counties have the ability to do a property search where you can look up an address by the property and see who is listed as the homeowner. And so that may be one easy first step that somebody could take. And if it seems overwhelming or if you feel like the situation would be more productive with maybe a third party, then you could have someone like myself or someone like you have a third disinterested party there who can start asking some questions because then it might be easier to have some support or maybe not have to ask all of those questions directly. Or it brings up the ability to talk about some of those things that perhaps haven't been talked about yet.
It definitely. And it definitely can also help to have an accountability partner. Okay, you said you're going to check about the deed on the house. That was a week ago. Did you get it done? And just sometimes having someone check that you're getting this done. And it doesn't have to all be done in 1 week, but just making little by little progress, just finding out where the files are kept. Who's on the will, things like this. And some of these are bigger than others, but making some progress towards finding out control of your finances is so extremely important.
And taking those little steps can really, maybe it's not as scary or difficult as you thought, or maybe they didn't have the reaction that you had created in your head. And so that can be helpful to just take those small steps. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the link between conflict, trauma, and how money manifests in our relationships and what strategies couples can employ to navigate these challenges, which we've already started to talk about a little bit, is just taking those small first steps, get a third party involved, whether it's a financial coach or advisor or a mental health professional. Are there other exercises or challenges that couples might be able to do together, or that individuals may be able to do on their own, that can help a little bit more in taking steps towards that?
Well, you list a lot in Be Your Money Hero. So if people haven't read that, they need to read your book. I would recommend just backing it all the way up to, what is your philosophy of money? I have my philosophy of money, but also, what is your philosophy of how to spend it? What is money used for? Some people like to have a bunch of money saved. That feels better. Some people feel money as a tool to be enjoyed, etc. And these people who feel you should save it and people who feel like you should spend it, they always marry each other. Right. But find out what is your partner's money philosophy. So start there and understand things at that level in order to have these discussions. But as we both know, money is so charged. The issue is people are afraid to address conflict. So that even without the skills of how do I manage any charged situation, money especially is one of them, but how do I address step 1, step 2, step 3? How do I manage my triggers? And so we're tying it to money specifically, but anything. The cashier is squashing my bread. My mom wants me to come for Christmas again. Without those skills to navigate, which is what I do, is help people navigate difficult situations with conflict and trauma. But relating it to money is being able to break that down. And the smaller, the better, because then you can handle the trauma triggers and you can handle the emotions tied to money.
So what are some tools that people can use to navigate through those triggers?
I would encourage people to become aware of their triggers. Is money a trigger? Some people are comfortable discussing money, and some people, money is extremely triggering for them. So just becoming aware of that. And then, where is the money trigger? Is it if money is, if it's not having, I think having the knowledge around the money is the issue. Right? It's the lack of knowledge around it. But where I see the issue of money becoming explosive is where there's a mismatch of how the money should be spent. Again, these people tend to marry each other, or one person wants it spent this way or that way. And when they're not communicating about the philosophy of money, is what I would call it. I mean, what do you see where it tends to be more explosive? That's where I see it.
I think when you really dig into it, and I'll speak from my own experience, is that I think that money can be a touchy topic in any relationship. But I've mentioned before that we tend to gravitate towards what makes us feel most safe or needed or wanted. Like, there is a need that we are meeting with money, and we have a tendency to spend our money in the way that we feel it's most safe for us or most useful for us. And so when we can get into some of these triggers, we might not recognize them as such. So if we find ourselves, I know that the biggest red flag for me is that disassociation that you talked about.
Exactly.
Like, I had a situation where my husband had said something that I should have been upset about, and I felt nothing. And so for me, I was like, that's not that's not normal for me. Like, I should be upset about this and I'm not, which means I've disassociated. That's a huge red flag. I have to talk to him about this. And I gave myself like a mental time frame. Like, I'm not gonna let this go past 3 days. Like, we've got 3 kids, we got 3 dogs, we got like a zoo at our house. It can be crazy. There has to be a good time when we can actually sit down and talk about it. But I gave myself like that mental deadline and I was like, hey, I'd really like to talk to you about this thing. For me, I know that my words can carry a lot of impact. And so I work to let myself cool down emotionally so that I can think through things a little more clearly, not say anything that I could regret later. And so for me, I like to give it a little bit of time for those emotions to fade. But I also have to hold myself accountable to not let it just go. There's a balance between those two things. And I think that those, if there's something that happens that maybe I feel resentful towards, that can be another red flag, that maybe there is something triggering it. And we have to just think of like, when did I start feeling that way? Like that's the process I go through, is when did I start feeling that way? Was there something that happened that kind of triggered that emotion? And why is that something that might be bothering me? And so through pulling myself back and kind of looking at it as if I was someone on the outside looking in, I'm able to get curious without self-judgment to dig into the root cause of what that feeling is. And so that's been part of the process that I've gone through in situations that I've run into. Do you find that there's other ways that people can dig into those and get to the bottom of what's actually bothering them?
It's interesting. Yes, it's interesting to hear. I love that you know your style, that you need to take a step back. You need to observe yourself, reflect, give yourself a deadline. I love all of that because sometimes people need to address it right away. And they're not comfortable until they address it right away and get it off their chest and like in the heat of the moment. And these people always marry each other. For some reason, they always, like, the person who needs to discuss it right now always marries the person who's like needs to cool off. So I don't know if Joe's like that.
He is a bit. He doesn't like things to go on too long because he is the opposite. It bothers him. But we tend to not be at a high level at the same time. So it's worked out for the most part.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. It's just funny. But it, like you said, it balances, so it's understanding your conflict resolution style. That's the whole thing. And that's where I coach people to figure out what works for them. Because some people just need to unpack what style, like you have a style and Joe has a style, figuring out your style and how does that work for you, but how does it work for your partner? And then coming to a compromise, which you two have already done. The other issue I see as you write about in Be Your Money Hero is people's beliefs about money. I worked with somebody who their parents told, this was an adult, their parents told this person, you're too stupid to handle money. As an adult, yeah. So the person's parents were handling all their money, and then, surprise, the parents don't live forever. And then as an adult, all their money got turned over to them. And obviously I was coaching them to be like, get ready to handle your money because your parents aren't going to, your parent at this point, they're not going to live forever. You're going to have to handle your money. When finally the mother passed away, she was surprised that she could handle her money. She said, this isn't hard. And I said, it's not that hard to budget and to manage money, because her parents had brainwashed her into thinking she was basically too stupid to manage her money. And she had believed that all those years. So I think we need to examine our beliefs, bottom line, about what we believe about ourselves in handling money, what money means to us, all those things, because those are, as you write about, are extremely impactful in our relationship with money.
It is surprising how often I see that, particularly in women, is, if they maybe are a little bit older, one spouse typically takes control of, taking care of the bills and doing all those things. And I think that it's great that if someone is more naturally better with numbers or they enjoy it, to let that person take the lead. But it's also so important to make sure that you know what's going on and where to find the login information and what bills are due, because I have seen situations where a partner has passed away and the other partner has no idea.
Absolutely.
And unexpected things happen, unfortunately. And a lot of people will think, well, that's not going to happen. I'll just take care of it later. But it is something that is important to just take control of, this week. Like, look at your calendar, make a money date. I know couples that have money dates. So they might go to the coffee shop, or I know one couple that even takes like a weekend retreat to talk about their financial goals for the year and stuff like that. So it doesn't have to be something that you dread or something that is uncomfortable. It can be something that you actually look forward to. It gives you the opportunity to line out some of those mid and longer term goals and be able to have those discussions.
And excuse me, for people who've had like a lot of abandonment in their childhood, they really enjoy their partner handling the money because it helps them to feel cared for in a way that they didn't have that caring in their childhood. So they sort of, in a way, collapse. Like, oh, you're taking care of me. And I think that's lovely to be cared for, but you're still an adult and you still need to be involved in the money decisions. We cannot just collapse and allow our partners to take over for us financially. We need to be involved because in the abandonment type of trauma, some people just want to allow the partners to take over everything for them. And I understand abandonment trauma is really, it's really impactful for the rest of that person's life.
And do you think that there are common myths or misconceptions about the connection between trauma and money that you encounter in your work that contributes to the communication behind maybe the communication style that someone brings forward with their partner or talking about money to someone else?
I think the biggest myth I see is that it's taboo to talk about money. I still see that, and people freeze up because they think money is so impactful. It's going to cause conflict. And people both bring that in, or one person brings that in. If I talk about this, it will definitely cause a fight. I cannot discuss this. I don't want to face that fight. And sometimes it does. It does, especially if one person controls all the assets. I don't want to start a fight about this. And I can understand that. Who wants to start a fight? But we still need to know what is happening financially because Stephanie, you and I both can tell stories. I have a friend and you have friends where one partner has passed away and left the other person with, responsible for everything. And I think everybody knows a story like this. So we all need to be aware of our financial situation.
So are there specific techniques that people can use when they're communicating with their partner to help them navigate those conflicts related to money and perhaps triggering something for themselves or their partners?
I think if they let their partner know that they're not threatening the partner, depending on the situation, again, if it's like your situation where the partner is open and warm and loving, I'm just trying to understand the situation, is different than if the partner is withholding the assets and trying to control the situation. That's technically called economic abuse, right? So if they're in a situation where it's economic abuse, which is a type of domestic violence, it's a very different situation. And it may actually be, it's worth discussing with a domestic violence counselor or a counselor who's familiar with domestic violence, because that's a very different situation. But I think it's worth letting your partner know, I'm just trying to understand our financial situation. Like you said, a money date, or I'm trying to understand, be involved, trying to help, rather than I'm trying to threaten you or question you. Sometimes people just misunderstand your intentions. I'm not questioning what you're doing with the money. I'm just trying to support you. I'm trying to be involved and not rock the boat in a way that's negative. You're supporting that person.
Is there a way to kind of differentiate between healthy financial boundaries and then patterns of avoidance or fear that's rooted in a past trauma?
Can you ask that question differently? So just so I'm clear on what you're asking.
How can someone tell the difference between having healthy financial boundaries, maybe it's passing the money responsibilities or the primary responsibilities off to a spouse versus those avoidant patterns. So perhaps we have a listener who's like, you know what? I'm one of those people. I love that my spouse or partner does all of the money stuff and I don't have to think about it. What's a good balance between taking care, allowing someone to take care of those responsibilities, but then also making sure that you're just not repeating that pattern of avoidance?
Got it. Okay. You said it earlier. It's awareness. Are you completely checked out and you don't know where the bank accounts are? You don't know how much is in your bank account. You don't know your ATM code. Are you dissociated? Or are you just saying, hey, my partner's better with numbers and they have an Excel spreadsheet. They love rocking this. And I can check into the checking account anytime I want. And I know how to get onto the Excel spreadsheet. Stephanie loves Excel spreadsheets. So I can check it anytime I want. Yes, she does. I can check it anytime I want, but my partner really rocks this. And so I'm going to do my thing and my partner's going to do, but I'm not checked out of the process. I'm just going to let them do their strengths and I can check in and out whenever I want. But it's not an avoidance thing. Like I'm just, checked out of the process and I don't know anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that there's another tool that I don't know that it's necessarily worked for Joe and I necessarily, because the way that we do things is he pays most of the bills. Like I know he's always looking at the checking account. I have a app that I use to track our spending. So that's how I keep track of what's kind of coming in and out. And we talk about expenses or things that might come up and those types of things. And I've given him like my login information for the budgeting app so that he can see, I do accounting type of work and taxes and that kind of stuff. So that's how my brain works, is I like to see all the pretty charts and the graphs and things like that. And I don't think he cares so much, but that's one way that we've tried to balance that, is he's doing the actual like transactional, paying the bills through the bill pay online system. And then I'm kind of tracking the spending more on an app. And so I think that there's lots of different ways that people can actually go through that. And there is no right or wrong way. It's finding what works best for you and whoever you're doing money with.
I think the only wrong way is being checked out and denial. I would say is not wrong, but is not healthy.
Yes.
Is not healthy, and is room for improvement there.
So if you are open to it, I would like to dive in a little bit more into what that economic abuse looks like, what some red flags can be, and perhaps some of the first awareness. And then perhaps we could talk about where some resources are if someone needs support in that area. Because coming from my background, there was also economic abuse. I've seen that in multiple controlling relationships where it is easier to, from a perpetrator's standpoint, it's easier to keep someone around if they don't have the means to leave.
Absolutely.
And so I would love to start raising some awareness in that arena if you are open to it. What are some red flags that people should be looking out for, especially if they're entering a new relationship?
Sure. I want to say I'm trained in domestic violence, but I'm not an expert in domestic violence. I do want to state that. Economic abuse is basically the perpetrator withholding or managing the funds of I hate to say the victim, but of the other person, right? They're managing the funds or not providing access to your money. So it could be everything from not telling you where the accounts are. It could be you don't know if you're on the house, even though you've asked. It could be giving you an allowance that's ridiculous, like $5 a week. Managing your money to that extent. Here's an example of you get an income like a retirement type of income or SSDI, and it goes into their account. And then therefore they have your funds, and then they give you a little allowance, like $10 a week. If you have to go to the grocery store and ask for things like tampons or hair care products, you have to, may I buy this? May I buy this? That's an example. It can happen between partners. It can happen with the elderly. That's very common of a child or adult child abusing an elderly. If that's happening, that needs to be reported. It's very difficult to prove in a domestic situation. It's very difficult to drill down. So I'm just trying to think of other examples of that, but it can control where you work. If they're controlling where you work because that controls your income, they can maybe refuse to let you leave the house so that you can earn an income that way. That's also considered economic abuse. I'm just trying to give examples more than anything. Yeah. Also, disparaging comments that, they'll never earn anything, or they couldn't work there. That's a little bit of a stretch for economic abuse, but even disparaging comments about your ability to handle money, we're kind of stretching into economic abuse. What are your thoughts, Stephanie?
One other example that comes to mind, because I know somebody who has gone through a situation, is the person threatens to call your work and say things that may probably are not true or are highly exaggerated in attempts for you to lose your job.
That's correct. Yep.
Forcing you to take days off of work, or there's so many different examples, but I think that's a pretty good start.
Yeah, and it's worth saying the fastest way for a woman to become homeless is to get divorced. And so we talk about, well, why doesn't she just leave, or why doesn't he just leave? And it's because the homelessness is a very real possibility when people become divorced. So that is a very big motivator for people to stay, in case people have it in their mind, well, just leave if you're being economically or any type of abused. Homelessness is one of the biggest reasons people stay.
And that's something that hits close to home for me, because I do work with shelters here locally that support people in those situations, particularly families. Family Promise is the organization that I work with that supports people in these types of situations. And I think that there are several different resources. There's the domestic violence hotline, and we'll put links to those resources in the show notes as well, so that if you are finding yourself in a situation like that, you can have some resources to turn to. But starting to take some small steps to have a life that you enjoy and to not have fear of your safety or putting yourself in an environment where you can actually thrive is something that I think that we should all strive towards. And I know it's not necessarily easy. I've seen those situations firsthand, but there is support out there. Are there other tools or resources that you have found are helpful?
I think working with domestic violence experts is the best idea. Here in Colorado Springs, we have TESSA. It's T as in Tom, E, S as in Sam, S as in Sam, A, TESSA. They're the best resource for everything, attorneys, and where to go and what to do, because that's their wheelhouse. That's what they do. I think we think of people in domestic violence situations are stupid or they got trapped, but this can happen to anyone. I've worked in mental health for 30 years. It happens to rich people. It happens to poor people. It happens to middle-class people. It can happen to anyone. And I think people who are living in those situations are amazing. They are amazing survivors. They're amazingly creative. It's this erosion process that happens to your self-esteem. It's this erosion, this mental erosion that happens to people that get them stuck. And I think I admire them, and I think they're They're incredible people. And I just wish the best for everybody to use that creativity and be safe and hopefully find a way out.
And I've seen so many people in these situations take steps, whether large or small. Usually it's one small step that you take to start you down that journey. And there's no one deserves to live like that, walking on eggshells or being in that situation. And I think that there, again, I want to reiterate the distinction between domestic violence and healthy relationships that just have some problems that need to be worked through. Those are two very different things.
Correct. Yeah. And even in healthy relationships, when we do something, our partners may be surprised. Our partners will be surprised because you've changed the dynamics, right? So just because we go home and we say, hey, I am going to address conflict differently, people are shocked that their partners are shocked. Like, wait a minute, I'm using my voice now. Why are you so surprised? Because it's like a spider web and you're bouncing your side of the spider web, which makes the whole thing bounce. And our partners need time to adjust. Right. It's called a change back reaction. Our partners are saying, change back. What are you doing? Quit bouncing the spider web. So we need to give people a chance to get used to us bouncing the spider web, even in a healthy situation. So I want to warn people that when you start using your voice, people are going to be a little bit surprised. We give them a chance to catch up with us.
And you had mentioned this earlier, but just letting our partners know, hey, this is something that I've been thinking about. This is I'm not coming at you. My husband calls it changing the rules. He's like, we go into relationships and then when we want something to change, if we don't have it, we're changing the rules. And so we have committed to touching in with each other, because I was like, I think that that's important, that we have the opportunity to talk about what those rules are, spoken or unspoken. Because I was like, right now, for example, it works out great that I cook dinner and you do the dishes. That, circumstances may change in the future where that doesn't make sense anymore, because we've got little kids. And by the time they're teenagers, it's going to change our lifestyle a little bit. And so it's great to be able to check in with your partner, whether it's on money or anything else, is checking in with those rules that are spoken or unspoken and see if something needs to be revised.
I love that. I love it.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we move into our closing questions?
Just real quickly, conflict can be addressed. Even for those of us with trauma in our background, conflict is just a set of skills. That's all it is. If you've learned to drive a car, if you've learned to ride a bike, you can learn to handle conflict. It's just some of us, like me and like you, Stephanie, we didn't learn those set of skills. So we have to go out into the world and learn them because our parents didn't teach them to us. That's all it is. It's just learning this new set, and it's teachable. And that's so exciting to me because we can learn and we can change and handle conflict in a comfortable way.
So if you're someone like me, and you're like, okay, you know what? This thing has been bothering me. I need to talk to my partner. It's eating at me, and I don't want to continue down this path because it's not healthy. It creates an unhealthy dynamic. I need to talk to my partner. What are some things that they should do next?
First, learn which triggers are, what are the triggers that are setting those off, right? Is it a money trigger? Is it the sex trigger? Can we talk about sex? I don't know if we can. Sorry. Yeah. I didn't ask. Okay. Is it the sex trigger? Is it the kid trigger? What is the trigger, right? So learn which one it is, and then learn where it is in your body. You had a great podcast on the somatic therapy. So learn to manage all the triggers, number one. That's sort of the theory. And then use the application of managing your triggers, 2. And then 3, learn the steps of conflict resolution. You already have a lot of those down. 4, just 3. And you're on your way. Pretty exciting.
Are there specific communication styles or verbiage that we can use? So for example, when we're having a conversation with a partner, it's really important to use words like I feel, or the story that I'm telling myself is. Are there other tools like that someone can use to help communicate with someone else in order to keep them from putting their defensive walls up?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a lot of what I do in coaching. So just briefly, a lot of it I say is, conversation is catching a ball, throwing a ball back and forth. And we're all worried about throwing the ball. So think about also catching the ball, because we're all like, what I have to say is let me throw the ball, but like also think about catching the ball. So, the receptive skills is one thing we can all do a lot better on. So that's, I guess, just off the top of my head, one thing I can think of.
I think that we often listen to respond and instead of listening to understand. And that can be a difficult thing, but sometimes during a conversation, I'll try to mentally think like, okay, how am I listening? Am I listening to understand or am I listening to respond? And so trying to be aware, and things are not going to go perfectly. You might not handle everything with 5 stars the first time you attempt a conversation. It's something that does take some practice. And I think that Brene Brown, I think it's Braving the Wilderness, is where she talks about some conflict that she had to have with her husband and she talks about that in the book. And so that one was helpful because there's certain phrases that Joe and I will use where I know I really need to pay attention. So if he says to me, the story that I'm telling myself is, that's a cue that I need to listen very closely because it's serious.
Uh-huh.
So we'll move into some of our closing questions. Where can people find you?
People can find me, the best way would be through my website, and that would be conquerconflict.com.
Perfect. And what does abundance mean to you?
Abundance means to me to have amazing connections with wonderful people.
I agree with that. What's some of the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I've ever received, probably 2 things, but the one I think about the most is I have a lot of friends who were in their 60s and 70s, and they really keep up their health. Because when you're, in your 30s and 40s, you just bounce back right away. And now that I'm in my 50s, I'm really seeing that they're in their 60s and 70s and they exercise and they walk and they hike. And I'm really seeing that if you can maintain your health, it's easier versus strength training and cardiovascular and all of that. It is so important as you get in your later years, like your 60s and 70s and even 80s. So I'm really taking that to heart: nutrition, sleep, all the things to keep my health up.
I think that's something to notate too, is when you're thinking about conflict and communication, if you're tired, you're probably not going to, or if you don't feel good, you'll probably be a little more on edge. So taking care of your health can make a big impact. I do
kickboxing twice a week, so that also takes a lot of steam out of me, and then it does help me be calmer after I've kicked something, twice a week for an hour and 45 minutes or whatever. Yeah. It blows off some steam. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us your experience and your knowledge. I'm very grateful.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun, Stephanie. I really appreciate the opportunity.
As we wrap up this episode of Be Your Money Hero, remember that your financial journey is a path of self-discovery. If you have questions that you would like answered on the show, please submit them to info@beyourmoneyhero.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, share your thoughts and insights with our growing community. Subscribe for more empowering discussions. And always remember, you have the power to be your money hero. Until next time, keep growing, money heroes.